the screen, and
Yeah.
I think you're about to go in presentation mode, so over to you.
Thanks. Morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. And thanks again to Juan and Michael for the invitation to come and speak this morning about Medina. I'm going to follow my previous two speakers on this panel and go a bit further, apologising that for me the ideas I'm presenting here very much draw on work I've already published, including my book on Medina. So I'm sorry about that, but I hope it speaks to themes that have been already discussed in other papers this morning and maybe yesterday as well. So Medina is obviously often and famously said to be something like the second holy city for Muslims after Mecca, and that status, if you like, that idea that Medina is a holy place, supposedly emerged in the 7th century. There are two ways, as modern historians, we might think about this late antique context for Medina's emergence as a holy city. So one of those contexts would be the imperial context, thinking about how after the conquests, as the Muslims establish an empire over the territories of the former Roman and Persian empires, they develop the sacred sites of Arabia, Mecca, and Medina in new ways. That's sort of reflected in the map on the right of the screen here. Most of these sites that are on that map of Medina are the earliest. They're developed and patronized and built up in the Umayyad period. The other way of thinking about the late antique context is, of course, the Arabian one, and for obvious reasons, that's the one I'll focus on in my talk today. The two contexts they're not necessarily explicitly joined up, although Medina does, as I'll go on to argue to show why I think this does become something we might call a sacred space in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. The way that it develops as a holy city after his death does take ideas about sanctity and holiness of place in a particularly different way. But that Arabian context is very important to understand the beginnings of Medina's history as a holy place. So why is that? It may seem like an obvious question, but why is that specifically Arabian context important? There is, to my knowledge, there is no evidence to suggest that Medina, or as it would have been known, Yathrib, in the pre-Islamic period, as a whole, was considered a sacred space, or is even particularly associated with ideas of holy places in the pre-Islamic period. So we do hear that there, from Islamic era sources, that the mountain Uhud to the north of Medina was apparently the site of an idol called a Saida, and a very late text, al-Maqrizi, from the 15th century, although meant to be citing a 9th century historian, talks about buyut in Medina that housed idols. So those baits might have existed. Otherwise, I think it's quite telling that the mentioned in earlier papers, Ibn al-Kalbi's Kitab al-Asnam, the main deity associated with the inhabitants of Medina, the Aus and the Khazraj, Manat, is said to have, the main shrine for Manat is said to have been somewhere near the coast between Mecca and Medina, and so not in Medina itself. So there's no particularly obvious indication that Yathrib or any part of the oasis of Yathrib was considered a particularly sort of holy place in pre-Islamic Arabian religion. So why does it become important to think about Yathrib as a holy place, a sacred space? Because as the document that I think Ilka raised earlier in his question to Nikolai's paper, the Constitution of Medina. The Constitution of Medina, that's a very modern term. It's not called anything like that in Arabic original, but it's what it's well known as to modern scholars. The Constitution of Medina, is a document that I won't go into why, but I also put great faith in its status as an early document, and not simply a fabrication from later centuries. It has many clauses. It is loosely speaking a treaty between several groups that inhabited the area of Yathrib, not all of them, but several of them, and regulates interactions between those groups, particularly over conflict and conflict resolution. But one clause of this document states that so Yathrib's Jawf, whatever that might have meant, is haram for the people who have concluded this document. There are two surviving versions of the Constitution of Medina that differ in minor ways, which is why I gave the second version. If you're interested on the slide, you can see how Abu Ubaid's text changes the vocabulary of that line, but not its meaning. So according to this constitution drawn up between Muhammad and his followers and some of the inhabitants of Yathrib, a part of Yathrib at least was declared haram. Now this clearly went on to have a hugely important resonance in later Muslims' memories of Medina and why Medina had become a holy place. So there are endless references in Muslim sources from as early as they survive, 8th, 9th century onwards, that refer to Medina as a haram and suggest that haram was established by the Prophet himself. So this is just one example from Bukhari. When the Prophet came back to Medina on his return from Khaybar, and Uhud, that mountain to the north, appeared before him. He said, "This is a mountain which loves us and which we love." Then he indicated with his hands towards Medina and said, "Oh God, I am making what is between the two volcanic tracts, the Harras, a haram, just as Abraham made Mecca a haram." So we get there the idea that, I suppose, this is an idea that Medina is a haram, and also putting it into a longer history of prophets and prophets making declaring certain spaces to be important for their communities. The status of Medina as a haram became very widely accepted amongst Muslims, but it was debated. This is a slightly odd source to take this debate from, Al-Mawardi's Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, but it's just a very nice, very brief description of the issue that was debated by later Muslim scholars. So he tells us that the third regulation distinguishing the Hijaz from other regions is that the city of the Messenger of God, so Medina, has a protected haram between its two volcanic tracts. It's forbidden to disturb its game, cut down its plants, just as for Mecca's haram. Abu Hanifa, however, declared that permissible and established Medina to be the same as all other lands. So a very brief way of summarizing that in Hanafi understandings, Medina wasn't a haram, but for everyone else, it was. And of course, the fact that that Mecca and Medina came to be known together very commonly as a haramain, the two harams, again sums up very nicely the fact that its declaration as such became such an important part of Muslims' memories of why Medina was sacred. Now, I do think, and I go into this in much more detail in my book, that later Muslims' understandings of what it meant to think of Medina as a haram were rather different from those ideas that are expressed in the Constitution of Medina. To give just one very obvious example, if I go back to the line from the Constitution of Medina, it describes the haram as being in Yathrib's Jawf. And that term Jawf is never used in any later source I've seen to describe the geography of Medina's haram. Medina's haram is defined in many different ways, most frequently as the area between the two harras, but it never uses that term Jawf. So there is a disconnect there between the Constitution of Medina's idea about Medina's haram and later ideas that we see in hadith, fiqh, and historical literature. Nonetheless, as we've heard so much this morning, haram is clearly a term with important Arabian precedents. I think, given the earlier papers, I don't need to dwell too much on this. Many people listening to this paper will know far more about the use of the root harama in a pre-Islamic epigraphy. But of course, the words from that root are used to refer to sacred spaces in some languages. It does appear in what is meant to be pre-Islamic poetry. The term haram, I'll give you one line there. We restrain the ignorant in our majlis. You see that the majlis is held among us like the haram. It doesn't tell us too much about what haram means, but it's clearly a kind of an important place. And then I won't go over again too much about how the word is used in the Quran, because I don't want to go over the material that Nikolai discussed earlier. But there are two, alongside all the uses of I guess, more adjectival usages of words like haram and muharram in the Quran, there are two instances of the noun haram being used clearly to refer to a space. In both instances, it's said to be ermin, that space is ermin, haram ermin, so a secure or protected haram. And the context of the verses as well gives great. It makes it very clear that it was considered to be a protected, some form of protected space where people's looks like people's properties were guaranteed for them. So, what is a haram? The summary from all this material of pre-Islamic material on harams gets me very close to the definition that Nikolai gave earlier, of a space that seems to be loosely set aside for regions of religious practice, that involve certain rules. The most common rules are to do with killing things. So you can't kill plants, you can't kill animals, you can't fight and kill people. There are lots of other little rules are hinted at as well, but very commonly it seems to be to do with violence. Now, this is one reason why a tradition of modern scholarship, often informed by anthropological discussions, has seen harams and the haram at Medina as a sort of form of conflict prevention, I suppose, in tribal society. So if you go back to the sort of 60s, 70s and think about Robert Sargent's work on sacred space in Arabia, that's very often the model that he applies, and he's by no means alone. But I don't think it helps us completely explain what's going on at Medina. The Constitution of Medina is a document concerned with resolving conflicts between people. So in that sense, it does perhaps work. But I think there are other reasons we have to look further. The one particularly obvious reason is that the signatories, we are told, who signed up to the Constitution of Medina did not include, by any stretch of the imagination, all the inhabitants of Yathrib. And it's not a particularly useful, a haram wouldn't have been a particularly useful idea as a form of space to prevent conflicts if not everybody signed up to it, I suppose. So that's one reason we might think about going further. And when I was looking for models that might give us an idea of why people established harams in Arabia, well, the best one I came across was this discussion. This version of this tale comes from a 10th century Arabic source, the Kitab al-Aghani. Of course, it comes with all the caveats of the problems of using later material to think about pre-Islamic Arabia. But I did find it helpful when it came to thinking about models of why Arabians might establish harams. And it goes back to this place called Bus, a little northwest or north of Mecca, somewhere around there. And in the Aghani, we get quite a long story of why Bus became a haram. It was a very short-lived haram. And I've tried to summarize the main bits on this slide and the next slide. So it's essentially given as a reason for why a man called Zuhair ibn Janab raided the tribe Ghatafan. And that's because one of the subgroups of Ghatafan were on their way they were traveling from Tehama, and they got into a battle with a tribe from Madhij who attacked them, but the Ghatafanis, the Banu Wagheed, won. And it says they became powerful and wealthy because of that, and they took much plunder. When they realized that they'd become powerful and wealthy, they decided they'd take a haram, the likes of the Meccan haram. And so they carried that out, and apparently there was a man in charge of the haram and the demarcation of its boundaries, Riyah ibn Zalim. and they created this haram at a water spot of theirs called Bus. Now, this creation of a haram at Bus greatly angered some of their rivals, particularly the Banu Kalb and their leaders, the Hayr ibn Janab, and who, in a moment of great rhetoric, says that will, by God, that will never happen while I'm alive. I won't leave them alone while they take a haram. And then to cut the story short, they attack at this haram and they defeat Ghatafan. They take one of them as a prisoner, and they take that prisoner into the haram at Bus. There is a debate about whether they're allowed to execute a prisoner in the haram at Bus, but I think for Zuhair, the whole point of this was to do that. And so he executed the prisoner there, and this declared that haram null and void. So we have here, I suppose, not so much an idea of a haram as conflict prevention. It created conflict rather than prevented it, but an idea that it seems to be an idea that perhaps some kind of status for a tribe or a group is attached to claiming the possession or the running of a haram, and that claim that having a haram makes to a sort of superior status could then get in the way of rivals' claims as well. And that then brings us back to Muhammad's declaration of a part of Yathrib as a haram, and helps us think a little bit beyond perhaps the idea of Medina as a haram just for internal reasons of conflict resolution, but thinking about that declaration of a haram at Yathrib more in the light of conflict with Quraysh, of Muhammad's at that time conflict with Quraysh. Quraysh are famously the bad guys in the constitution of Medina. They're the one group for whom no protection can be guaranteed, and clauses like that. And it seems that perhaps one way of thinking about this might be that at a time when the Prophet and his community are excluded from let's say the Meccan haram. Nikolai talked us through great detail earlier about how the Quran recognizes a Beit Haram, a Masjid Haram, and if that is indeed Mecca, and Muhammad's community was not in Mecca, in Medina, that they may have seen the declaration of their own haram here in that sort of Hijazi context of why harams were created, as a way of challenging Quraysh. I just want to end by thinking about the question that Ilka asked Nikolai earlier about, in light of the constitution of Medina and its declaration of Yathrib as a haram, might we understand some of the Quranic ideas about haram as referring to Yathrib? I suppose it's hard to be certain. I've never particularly thought of it in that way myself, but the issue seems to me, and I don't think it's not a terrible issue, but it seems to me that and I wonder what others think, that the Quran seems to recognize one haram, one Masjid Haram, one Beit Haram, and traditionally, of course, that's not understood to have been Medina. So that, to me, means that we might be thinking about what haram means in Yathrib in a rather different way to what haram meant at Mecca or in the Quran. And we might be thinking of, well, it's possible we're thinking of one word that's used for two different concepts, but more plausibly, we might be thinking about two different interpretations or two different practices based around a sort of Arabian Hijazi institutional idea. The meaning of haram goes on to change very obviously in the decades and centuries after this, but that story would take us far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. So I'll end there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating, and it got me thinking about these sort of concepts of declaring specific spaces haram, as it were,